Good morning, Alex and friends. I'm Grace. Today is Tuesday, January 13th, 2026, and you're listening to Alex's News. The high in Riverside today is 70 degrees, with a low of 45.5 degrees, so expect a mild winter day perfect for getting out and about without bundling up too much. Coming up on the show, we'll break down the motivations behind President Trump's recent threats to impose tariffs on nations continuing trade with Iran, and examine the federal court's decision to overturn his administration's cancellations of clean energy grants, deeming them politically motivated. Plus, we'll cover a few other key developments from around the world and at home. All this and more on Alex's News. Stay tuned. This morning, tensions between the United States and Iran are climbing fast, with protests, a deadly crackdown, and new tariff threats all colliding. Ethan is here to walk us through what is happening.
These protests in Iran began in late December, about 2 weeks ago, after the local currency, the rial, basically crashed. According to Reuters, it is now trading at well over $1 million to the dollar, wiping out savings and sending prices for basics like food and fuel soaring. What started as anger over inflation and empty wallets has turned into something much bigger, a direct challenge to the clerical system led by 86-year-old Supreme Leader Ayatollah Ali Khamenei.
So it began with people struggling to afford groceries, but what are protesters demanding now?
Demonstrators are now openly calling for an end to clerical rule, more political freedom, and relief from repression, especially for women and ethnic minorities. Deutsche Welle reports that protests have spread far beyond Tehran into Kurdish regions like West Azerbaijan, Kurdistan, Kermanshah, and Elam. You are seeing young people, women defying the hijab rules, and long-time marginalized groups all marching together, which is unusual and deeply threatening for the regime.
And how is Iran's government responding on the streets?
The response has been ferocious. Security forces from the Revolutionary Guard and the Basij militia have rolled out heavy equipment, set up checkpoints, and are stopping cars to search them and force people to unlock their phones. The Washington Post reports that authorities are sending mass text messages branding protesters as, quote, rioters and terrorists, end quote. And Iran's Attorney General has gone even further, calling them, quote, enemies of God, end quote, a crime that can carry the death penalty under Iranian law.
We keep hearing about a communications blackout there. How much do we really know about what is happening?
Not as much as we would like, and that is by design. Groups like NetBlocks say Iran has pushed internet access down to roughly 1% of normal for 5 straight days, which means video and photos leak out only slowly. Human rights monitors are relying on landlines, smuggled memory cards, and even experimental tools like satellite-based mesh networks to piece together what is happening, but there are long delays and big blind spots.
Given all that, what do we know about casualties so far?
A U.S.-based group called Human Rights Activists News Agency, or HRANA, which has a strong track record from earlier protests, says at least around 600 people have been killed in the past 2 weeks. They estimate more than 500 of those are protesters, and close to 90 are security personnel, with over 10,000 arrests, all cross-checked against hospitals and morgues. A Norway-based group, Iran Human Rights, puts the death toll even higher, in the mid-600s, and warns the true number may be significantly larger because, according to their sources, Revolutionary Guard units are whisking bodies away without paperwork.
But we are also hearing wildly higher numbers from some opposition outlets. How credible are those?
There is a huge range. An opposition channel called Iran International has talked about as many as 12,000 deaths, including what it describes as a massacre around January 8th and 9th. But major outlets like the Associated Press say there is no way to verify that right now. United Nations investigators and groups like Amnesty International have so far been able to confirm only a few dozen deaths with documents and testimony, but they describe reports of hundreds killed as, quote, credible, end quote, and say the blackout almost certainly means undercounting, not exaggeration.
Then you have that anonymous Iranian official telling Reuters as many as 2,000 people are dead. Why would the government float a number like that?
That figure reportedly came from a senior official who blamed, quote, terrorists and foreign agitators, end quote, suggesting the government wants to frame this as a war against outside enemies rather than a domestic uprising. By admitting a much higher toll off the record, Tehran may be trying to prepare the public for grim news while still controlling the narrative. Analysts told Reuters that it is also a way to justify the severity of the crackdown as a necessary response to supposed foreign-backed violence.
Let us talk about what people on the ground are seeing. What does daily life look like in Tehran right now?
Witnesses described to the BBC and others a capital city that feels eerie and tense. Streets that would normally be crowded are almost empty at key times, especially around prayers, because families are terrified their kids will be swept up in arrests, or worse. At the same time, state television is showing large pro-government rallies, like the one yesterday that filled Engalab, or Islamic Revolution, Square, with crowds chanting, quote, death to America, end quote, and, quote, death to Israel, end quote, to project strength and unity.
How much of those pro-regime rallies are genuine support versus pressure to show up?
It is a mix. The Associated Press notes these rallies often rely on government employees, students, and military families who are strongly encouraged or effectively ordered to attend, with buses and incentives laid on. But there is also a hardcore base that truly believes the protests are foreign plots, and state TV is labeling the marches as an uprising against, quote, American Zionist terrorism, end quote, while almost ignoring the original economic triggers like inflation and sanctions.
Speaking of America, how has President Trump responded so far?
The president has leaned in hard, rhetorically and potentially economically. Over the past few days, he has cast the United States as a defender of Iranian protesters, while also warning Tehran against further bloodshed. On a flight last week, according to Pool reports, he told reporters the crackdown was a, quote, red line, end quote. Iran was, quote, starting to cross, end quote, and said his national security team is weighing, quote, very strong options, end quote, including cyber attacks, targeted airstrikes, and expanding technology aid to help Iranians get back online.
That brings us to the tariffs he announced yesterday. What exactly did he say?
In a Truth Social post on Monday, the 12th of January, he declared, quote, effective immediately, end quote, that the United States would slap 25% tariffs on, quote, any and all business, end quote, American companies do with countries that continue trading with Iran. He singled out China, which buys the vast majority of Iran's oil, along with Russia, Turkey, Brazil, and the United Arab Emirates. He called this move, quote, final and conclusive, end quote, and warned that any Iranian retaliation would be met with strikes, quote, at levels they have never been hit before, end quote.
That sounds sweeping, but are those tariffs actually enforced today?
Not yet, at least not in any enforceable way. The Washington Post and The Guardian both point out there is no executive order, no notice in the Federal Register, and no formal guidance from the U.S. Trade Representative or Customs and Border Protection. Without those details, things like which products are affected, how to define Iran-related trade, and what tariff lines to adjust, border agents simply cannot collect the duties, especially on goods already in transit.
So is this more of a political threat for now, or could it quickly become real policy?
Trade lawyers told Reuters this looks very similar to a Venezuela tariff threat the administration floated in 2025, which created headlines but quietly fizzled without legal follow-through. Still, under U.S. law, the president does have tools like the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, Section 301 of the 1974 Trade Act, and Section 232 of the 1962 Trade Expansion Act, which can be invoked for national security or unfair practice reasons. If the White House decides to move, it could issue formal documents in days, though any sweeping, across-the-board tariff on all trade with major partners would invite court challenges.
How would these tariffs differ from the Iran sanctions we saw in the 2010 decade?
Back then, under laws like CISADA and the National Defense Authorization Act, the United States used what are called secondary sanctions, mostly targeting specific sectors like oil, banking, and shipping. According to analysts at the Council on Foreign Relations, those measures focused on cutting Iran off from the global financial system, while offering waivers or phase-in periods for allies. The new tariff idea is broader and blunter, essentially a tax on everything Americans trade with any country that still does business with Iran, which could, for example, push average tariffs on Chinese goods up toward the low 70s in percentage terms, hitting U.S. consumers and firms directly.
How are other countries reacting to that possibility?
China has been particularly vocal. Its foreign ministry has condemned what it calls, quote, unilateral long-arm jurisdiction, end quote, and vowed to take, quote, all necessary measures, end quote, if Washington actually imposes these duties, according to Deutsche Welle. Russia has echoed Tehran's line about foreign interference and seems unlikely to cut ties, while trade-dependent partners like Turkey, the United Arab Emirates, and Brazil are quietly running the numbers on whether they can afford to keep buying Iranian goods if it costs them access to the American market.
What about Europe, where governments often try to balance human rights concerns with avoiding war?
Europe's tone has been sharp, but more cautious on escalation. The European Parliament President, Roberta Metsola, announced that Iranian diplomats are now banned from entering parliament buildings, saying they will not, quote, legitimize, end quote, a regime accused of torture. France's Emmanuel Macron has condemned, quote, state violence, end quote, against protesters demanding rights, and the European Union is weighing tougher sanctions on Iranian officials tied to abuses, arms transfers to Russia, and nuclear activities, but many European capitals are wary of endorsing U.S. military intervention.
Inside Europe, Germany seems to be taking a particularly active role. What are they doing?
German politicians, including Iran-born Green Party leader Omid Nuripur, are pushing to designate the Revolutionary Guard as a terrorist organization at the European level, according to Euractiv. He and others have argued Germany should focus on supporting civil society and providing tools to get around the blackout, while ruling out joining any American strikes. There is also talk in Berlin of hosting an, quote, Iran summit, end quote, that would bring together dissidents, diaspora groups, and governments to plan for both continued unrest and a potential political transition.
Let us go back briefly to the diplomatic track. Is anyone actually talking to anyone? Or is this all threats and slogans?
Despite the tough language, there are quiet channels. President Trump has said Iran has reached out privately for talks, even as its foreign minister publicly blames the unrest on U.S. and Israeli meddling. The Washington Post reports that intermediaries, including Oman's foreign minister and the U.S. Special Envoy Steve Witkoff, have been shuttling messages, but Trump has set preconditions on Iran's nuclear and missile programs that Tehran currently calls non-negotiable, so any meeting could happen against a backdrop of rising violence.
Meanwhile, what is happening with oil and global markets as all this plays out?
Oil prices have jumped toward the mid-60s per barrel, reflecting fears that Iran's more than 3 million barrels per day of output could be disrupted by unrest or new sanctions. Time magazine notes that global stock markets are wobbling, not only because of the human rights crisis, but also because Trump's tariff threat injects fresh uncertainty into trade with China and others. For Iran itself, the collapsing rial and inflation already above 40% mean everyday people are paying far more for rice, meat, and even subsidized gasoline, and economists warn the protests, sanctions, and tariff fears together are a kind of triple shock.
And for Americans here at home, what would the concrete economic impact be if these tariffs take effect?
Many of the costs would show up quietly in higher prices for consumer goods and intermediate parts imported from countries like China and Turkey. The Atlantic Council points out that layering these Iran-linked tariffs on top of existing duties could make it much harder for small manufacturers and retailers to absorb the hit without raising prices or cutting jobs. It would also likely trigger retaliation abroad, potentially hitting American exporters at a fragile moment for the U.S. economy.
What guidance is the U.S. government giving to its own citizens who are in or near Iran right now?
The U.S. Virtual Embassy for Iran, which operates online because there is no physical embassy there, has urged Americans to leave the country immediately. They warn of arbitrary arrests, limited consular help in any crisis, and the risk of being caught up in mass detentions. Airlines are also adjusting, with carriers like Lufthansa extending suspensions of flights to Tehran into late January over security concerns.
Looking at the big picture, how do experts describe the risk of this moment if things go wrong?
Several analysts told outlets like Reuters and Deutsche Welle that Iran is now facing what they call a, quote, four-front war, end quote. There is the economic front, with sanctions and a currency collapse, the psychological front as the regime battles dissent and tries to project confidence, the military front, given U.S. and Israeli pressure after last June's 12-day war that damaged Iranian nuclear sites and weakened allies like Hezbollah, and the domestic front, where the protests are the most serious internal challenge in years. Any miscalculation on one of those fronts, especially if Trump turns his tariff talk into action or orders strikes, could widen the crisis very quickly.
Ethan, in just a sentence or two, what are you watching most closely over the next few days?
Two things. First, whether the death toll continues to climb as the blackout drags on, which would deepen international outrage. And second, whether the White House quietly issues the legal paperwork that would turn yesterday's tariff threat into a real policy shock, because that would be a clear sign this confrontation is moving into a new and much riskier phase.
A fast-moving, deeply worrying story on several fronts. Ethan, thanks for breaking it down for us. A blockbuster ruling out of Washington could bring billions back to clean energy projects and deals a blow to President Trump's energy agenda. Reporter Chloe Martin is following it. Chloe, what exactly did this judge decide, and why is it such a big deal?
The judge said the Trump administration broke the Constitution when it yanked a huge pot of clean energy money out of mostly Democratic states. According to coverage in the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette and Al Jazeera, U.S. District Judge Amit Mehta ruled yesterday, January 12, that roughly $7.6 billion in grants were canceled in a way that violated equal protection under the Fifth Amendment. He found that the Department of Energy and the White House Budget Office deliberately targeted projects in 16 states that voted for Kamala Harris in the 2024 election. That makes this not just an energy story, but a major test of whether presidents can use federal dollars to punish political opponents.
How did these cuts come about in the first place? Walk us back to when this started.
This really grew out of last fall's government shutdown, which began October 1, 2025, and dragged into early this year. According to reporting from OPB in Oregon, WHAS in Kentucky, and Trib Live in Pennsylvania, the Trump administration used that budget chaos to announce it was canceling hundreds of clean energy grants. Those were projects funded under the Inflation Reduction Act and the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law. Things like modernizing the power grid, cutting emissions, and scaling up clean technologies. Officials framed it as a fiscal cleanup, saying they were reviewing so-called lame duck awards made late in the Biden-Harris administration.
And Judge Mehta basically said, no, this wasn't routine house cleaning, this was politics. What evidence did he lean on?
He laid out a pretty stark pattern. In his 17-page opinion in City of St. Paul versus Department of Energy, he noted that out of 315 grants that got canceled, 314 were in those 16 Harris-voting states, and just one was in a Trump-supporting state. He cited what he called a, quote, glaring commonality, end quote. The map lined up almost perfectly with the electoral map. Then he dug into the words of administration officials themselves. The Washington Post and Al Jazeera have pointed to social media posts from Budget Director Russell Vought calling the projects the, quote, left's climate agenda, end quote, and the, quote, green news scam, end quote. In a fall 2025 interview on One America News, President Trump said he was, quote, allowed to cut things that never should have been approved, end quote, and specifically pointed to Democratic-favored climate initiatives. And even the Energy Department's own lawyers admitted in court filings that decisions were, quote, influenced by whether a grantee's address was located in a state that tends to elect Democratic candidates, end quote.
So we know the targeting was partisan. Which states and which types of projects got hit the hardest?
The core of the damage was in 16 Democratic-leaning states, California, Colorado, Connecticut, Delaware, Hawaii, Illinois, Maryland, Massachusetts, Minnesota, New Hampshire, New Jersey, New Mexico, New York, Oregon, Vermont, and Washington. Analyses by the Environmental Defense Fund and financial outlets Seeking Alpha show it was an incredibly broad set of projects. In California, about $1.2 billion for the Arches hydrogen hub was wiped out, a centerpiece for clean fuel production in the state. A roughly $1 billion Pacific Northwest hydrogen hub spanning Oregon and Washington was also terminated. Hundreds of smaller grants aimed to upgrade battery manufacturing for electric vehicles and capture carbon dioxide from factories, especially in industrial corridors in Illinois and New York. Colorado lost methane reduction programs targeting leaks from oil and gas operations, and Massachusetts saw grid modernization money put on ice. All of this comes as AP reporting, aggregated by My Mother Lode, showed carbon pollution ticking up again in 2025 because of a cold winter, high natural gas prices, and a surge in power-hungry data centers. So the cuts were landing just as emissions were starting to rise.
Let's talk about the people who sued. Who brought this case, and what did they actually win as of today?
The lead plaintiff was the city of St. Paul, Minnesota, joined by environmental and energy groups including the Environmental Defense Fund, Elevate Energy, the Interstate Renewable Energy Council, Plug in America, and a local group called the Southeast Community Organization. According to Notice and KERA News in Texas, they argued that during the shutdown, the administration exploited its power to, quote, inflict deliberate hardship, end quote, on political rivals. In terms of immediate relief, they won something fairly narrow but symbolically huge. Judge Mehti ordered 7 specific grants reinstated right away, worth about $27.6 million in total. That includes funding for St. Paul's own energy efficiency work and related community-based programs. But that's still just a sliver of the roughly $7.6 billion that were canceled overall.
So those 7 grants come back now, but the rest of the money's still up in the air?
Exactly. The ruling does not automatically restore every canceled grant, and we are talking about more than 200 projects covering more than 300 awardees. What it does do, as legal experts have been telling outlets like Politico Pro, is declare the entire cancellation scheme unconstitutional as a matter of equal protection. That creates a roadmap for other states, cities, and companies to sue and demand their money back. You can already see the next wave forming. California Attorney General Rob Bonta has been leading coalitions against freezes on programs like Solar for All, and according to the Las Vegas Sun, he's signaling that this decision strengthens those challenges. New York Attorney General Letitia James is reviewing how to use the ruling to unstick billions in offshore wind and grid funds for her state, Politico Pro reports. So St. Paul was the test case, but it probably will not be the last.
The Trump administration is clearly not taking this lying down. What are they saying in response?
Publicly, the line is that this was about safeguarding taxpayer money, not punishing blue states. Yesterday, and again today, Department of Energy spokesman Ben Dieterich said the agency, quote, disagrees with the judge's decision, end quote, stands by our review process, end quote. He added that many of the canceled projects failed to, quote, meet the standards necessary to justify the continued spending of taxpayer dollars, end quote, or, quote, adequately advance the nation's energy needs, end quote. Energy Secretary Chris Wright has echoed that, arguing the grants were rushed and poorly vetted during the Biden transition. And to rebut claims of partisan bias, officials keep pointing to an earlier round of cuts in May 2025, where more than $1 billion in Texas-based projects involving ExxonMobil and Calpine were trimmed. The argument there, reported by Dallas News and others, is that red states also felt pain, so this was not purely ideological.
But a lot of analysts say that red-blue comparison doesn't really hold up. What do we know about those inconsistencies?
Data journalists and watchdogs have been digging into that. Dallas News and a smaller outlet, Benzatine, reviewed internal cost-benefit numbers and found something awkward for the administration. Projects in Democratic-leaning states with higher benefit-cost ratios were often canceled, while comparable or weaker projects in Republican states got extensions or waivers. In other words, If this really was just about financial performance, you would not expect the cuts to fall almost entirely on one side of the political map. That pattern is part of what persuaded Judge Mehta that the stated reasons were pretextual, essentially window dressing for a political goal. He wrote that there was no, quote, plausible, rational connection, end quote, between the cancellations and legitimate aims like fiscal efficiency or project viability. That kind of language is a red flag in administrative law. It signals the court believes agencies are not telling the real story about why they acted.
Is anybody inside the government formally investigating whether politics drove these decisions?
Yes, there is an internal probe underway. According to House oversight documents and coverage in the Columbia Basin Bulletin, the Energy Department's Inspector General opened an audit in December 2025. That investigation is looking at whether partisan considerations played an improper role in deciding which grants to pull. Inspectors general do not have the power to rewrite policy, but they can issue scathing reports, refer matters for discipline, and hand material to Congress or the Justice Department. So whatever that audit uncovers could feed into future lawsuits, and it could shape how judges view the administration's explanations in other cases.
Let's look ahead. As of this morning, have they filed an appeal? And what happens next legally?
As of late today, January 13th, the Justice Department and the Energy Department still have not filed a formal notice of appeal or an emergency motion to pause the ruling. But market and legal analysts quoted by Barchart, KFGO, and the Indianapolis Business Journal all say they expect filings by the end of the day. The administration is likely to go first to the D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals and ask for what is called an administrative stay. They used that playbook in 2025 to pause an Environmental Protection Agency Green Bank program. If they get a similar stay here, it would temporarily block the reinstatement of those 7 grants while the case moves forward. If they do not, then at least some of that clean energy money will start flowing again, even as the bigger constitutional fight continues.
You mentioned legal experts seeing this as part of a bigger pattern on executive power. How are they reading Judge Mehta's opinion?
Scholars writing in places like the Harvard Law Review and on Al-Mayadeen's legal pages are connecting this ruling to 2 Supreme Court decisions. One is Department of Commerce versus New York in 2019, where the court said the Trump administration could not offer a phony reason for adding a citizenship question to the census. The other is Bowling versus Sharp, a mid-20th century case that applied equal protection principles through the Fifth Amendment to federal actions. In their view, Judge Mehta essentially told the executive branch you cannot take congressionally appropriated funds under laws like the Inflation Reduction Act and the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law and then claw them back just because voters in those states backed the other party. It also reinforces limits in the Impoundment Control Act, which was passed after Watergate to stop presidents from unilaterally sitting on money Congress ordered them to spend. One commentator put it this way:
Bring this down to earth for listeners. What does all this mean for people who were counting on these projects?
For communities and companies on the ground, time really is money. Lawyers for the grantees are already preparing motions to enforce Judge Mehta's order, arguing that every month of delay causes what the law calls irreparable harm. For hydrogen hubs in California and the Pacific Northwest, according to EDF and Seeking Alpha, suppliers are already walking away, equipment orders are being canceled, and workforce training programs are stalling. In Rust Belt areas of Pennsylvania and the Midwest, battery plants and grid upgrades meant a shot at new manufacturing jobs and more reliable power. When you pull $7.6 billion out of that pipeline, contractors fold, local governments lose matching funds, and residents stay stuck with older, dirtier infrastructure. So while the legal arguments are about equal protection and administrative law, the day-to-day impact is jobs, air quality, and whether communities can keep up with extreme weather and rising demand for electricity.
You also mentioned another energy ruling that came down yesterday. How does that fit into this broader pushback on the administration's agenda?
That one involved offshore wind, not grants, but it points in the same direction. On the same day as the St. Paul ruling, yesterday, Judge Royce Lamberth cleared the way for the Revolution Wind project off Rhode Island and Connecticut to resume after opponents claimed it would seriously harm marine wildlife. Coverage from outlets like Greenfield Reporter, KIRO in Seattle, and GV Wire in California notes that he rejected those claims and allowed federal permits to stand. So on one front, a court is saying you cannot strip away funding from clean energy projects for partisan reasons, and on another front, a court is saying you cannot use shaky environmental claims to stop a major offshore wind farm. Together, they send a message that judges are scrutinizing the legal justifications behind key pieces of the administration's energy rollback, not just taking them at face value.
Big picture now, Chloe. What does this mean for President Trump's second-term energy agenda going forward?
It means the courts are becoming one of the main arenas where climate and energy policy will be decided. According to AP roundups carried by My Mother Lode, this ruling is part of what they call a multi-front legal assault on the administration's efforts to unwind Biden-era climate programs. Every time the administration moves to delay or defund a big clean energy project, there is now a stronger chance someone sues and cites this case. Politically, it could harden the divide between red and blue states on infrastructure. Democratic-leaning states may lean even more on the courts and on coalitions of attorneys general to protect their projects. And inside Washington, officials are likely to get far more lawyered up in how they talk about cuts and reviews, trying to avoid the kind of candid partisan remarks that Judge Mehta used against them here.
Finally, what are the key things you'll be watching over the next few days as this story develops?
The first is whether the Justice Department actually files that notice of appeal and an emergency stay request with the D.C. Circuit by tonight or tomorrow. The second is how quickly the Energy Department moves to reinstate those 7 grants Judge Mehta ordered restored. Any foot-dragging there could trigger fresh motions in his courtroom. I will also be watching state attorneys general like Rob Bonta and Letitia James to see if they file their own suits now that they have this precedent in hand. And, of course, watch Capitol Hill. House and Senate Democrats are already signaling they will use this ruling to press for hearings on politically motivated cuts to infrastructure dollars. If that happens, the Internal Energy Department audit and any new data about who lost funding and why will be front and center.
A lot at stake and a lot more to come. Reporter Chloe Martin, thanks for breaking it down for us. Here are some other headlines. At the U.S. Supreme Court, it was culture war tip-off at Center Court. Justices heard Little versus Hecox and West Virginia versus BPJ, 2 cases testing whether state bans on transgender women and girls in female sports violate the 14th Amendment's Equal Protection Clause and, in West Virginia's case, clash with Title IX. Representing the Trump administration, Solicitor General D. John Sauer argued the bans should stand, calling separation by biological sex eminently reasonable to preserve fairness. Idaho runner Lindsay Hecox asked to withdraw her case after leaving collegiate sports and citing harassment fears, but the court held off on declaring the dispute moot. A ruling expected by June could decide whether sex in federal law includes gender identity and effectively blow the whistle on similar bans now active in 27 states. In Detroit, President Trump changed lanes from foreign flare-ups like Venezuela and Iran to the hood open, wallet empty worries of the American economy. Ahead of the 2026 Detroit Auto Show, he toured Ford's storied River Rouge complex in Dearborn before a 2 p.m. speech to the Detroit Economic Club and Motor City Casino, pitching a revival in manufacturing to ease high consumer costs and sagging factory jobs. He's expected to promote populist proposals like a temporary 10% cap on credit card interest rates and a ban on Wall Street firms buying single-family homes, turning private equity into less private property. The visit overlaps with the club's 14th annual Michigan Economic Outlook meeting, where a new survey highlights 2026 challenges in trade and talent, as Republicans hope an economic tune-up boosts their mileage heading into the 2026 midterms. In The Hague, the International Court of Justice is deep into the merits phase of the Gambia's case accusing Myanmar's military of genocide against the Rohingya, with public hearings running January 12 through 29. Gambia's Justice Minister Dauda Jallow told judges the Rohingya suffered the most horrific violence imaginable, while more than 1 million refugees in camps in Bangladesh await a ruling that could pave a road back with citizenship and protections. The judgment, still months or years away, will help set the legal bar for proving genocidal intent and is expected to influence South Africa's case against Israel over the Gaza war and Ukraine's case against Russia. The ICJ has also extended Israel's deadline to file its full defense in the South Africa case to March 12, 2026, proof that justice often moves at the speed of docket, not rocket. At the United Nations, the temperature over Ukraine dropped well below freezing. The U.S. accused Russia of a dangerous and inexplicable escalation after Moscow launched a nuclear-capable Oreshnik ballistic missile near NATO member Poland, then followed with massive drone and missile barrages. This week, Russia fired nearly 300 drones and missiles across Ukraine, hammering power grids and killing at least 4 people in Kharkiv, a chilling weaponization of winter that Western officials see as a deliberate snub to U.S. diplomacy. The salvo comes as the Trump administration pushes a 28-point peace plan, led by envoys Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner, featuring a proposed peace council and phased sanctions relief, even while Washington readies a newly greenlit package of harsh economic sanctions. For now, Russia's hypersonic show and tell is less a peace overture than a warning shot at NATO, complicating hopes for a ceasefire as the war nears its 4-year mark next month. And in artificial intelligence, the cloud is getting both clinical and geopolitical. Anthropic has launched Claude for Healthcare, a HIPAA-minded assistant wired into clinicaltrials.gov and personal health data from Apple and Android devices, following OpenAI's debut of ChatGPT Health, a sign that bedside manner is turning into bite-side manner. On Capitol Hill, the House voted to close the cloud loophole, giving the Commerce Department new power to block foreign adversaries from renting U.S. AI hardware through cloud services, export control by other means, or at least by other screens. OpenAI and SoftBank announced a $1 billion investment in SB Energy to power Stargate data centers, part of a projected $3 trillion global build-out, already straining U.S. power grids and sparking pressure on tech giants to keep utility bills from shocking ratepayers. A new report from the International Regulatory Strategy Group warns of a looming compliance splinternet as the UK's outcomes-focused regime diverges from the EU's Prescriptive AI Act, due in August 2026, signs that AI's free-for-all is fading, replaced by a rules-heavy era where silicon, sovereignty, and the 2026 midterms are tightly intertwined. That's all we have for now. Today's episode was made by Alexander King with GPT-5, Gemini Pro 3, Gemini Flash 3, and Google Cloud Text-to-Speech. I hope you have a great day. I'll see you tomorrow, Alex.